Sharonda Jeffries is a program manager for Cisco Systems, where she's responsible for providing internal consulting support and training. She has more than 20 years experience serving as a third-party quality auditor and as a consultant to Fortune 500 companies, specializing in quality management systems implementation and auditing. Jeffries represents Cisco Systems at Quest Forum, an industry collaboration of companies dedicated to ICT supply chain quality and performance. In addition, she's a certified quality auditor, a senior member of ASQ, a charter member of ASQ's Quality Audit Division, and an ASQ Audit Division Regional Counselor. Sharonda, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm speaking on behalf of Quest 4, and I'm going to be talking about our program, which is intended to assure the integrity of our TL9000 third-party certification process. Now, many of you may not be familiar with TL9000. TL9000 is our Information and Communication Technology, or ICT, version of ISO 9001. It includes all the requirements of ISO 9001, plus additional requirements specifically for our industry. It also includes measurement. And there are many organizations that maintain third-party certification. Now, we partnered together because we wanted to share in improving our industry. We wanted to assure that TL9000 certified organizations produce quality products and services consistently, and that we all demonstrate continual improvement. This required everyone working together towards that mutual goal. This was the TL9000 certified organizations working along with customers who expect those organizations to indeed provide quality products and services consistently. Quest Forum actually owns and develops the TL9000 handbooks, and we partnered with our certification bodies and accreditation bodies as well. Quest Forum, we initiated a validation audit project. And the purpose of this validation audit project, and it was actually a 3-year project, was to collect objective information for evaluation. We had received some feedback from multiple Quest Forum members that questioned the performance of some of our TL9000 certified organizations in the supply chain. They said that those organizations were not performing as expected. So we launched a 3-year effort. Quest Forum, we're a data-driven organization. You heard me say that our TL9000 standard, it consists of 2 parts, requirements and measurements. We're a data-driven organization. So we said, let's launch an effort to drive improvement. Let's launch an effort to gather data. So the validation audit project was born. Participants in the project included Quest Forum member organizations, TL9000 certified organizations, our certification bodies, and also accreditation bodies. Now, what's interesting is all of the accreditation bodies in our TL9000 certification process, all accreditation bodies performed validation audits. The validation audit project began, and as I said previously, it's a 3-year project. We conducted 12 validation audits. Now, what's interesting is we had actually scheduled more audits than that, but after conducting the 12 validation audits, and they were performed globally throughout the world, there were 5 TL9000 certification organizations that were identified with major nonconformities. Now, I will tell you, word of caution, the validation audits, they are not the same as witness audits. We looked at the witness audit program and we decided not to utilize the witness audit program. So we put together something that was a little bit different. It was a validation audit program, and it sampled certain key requirements of the TL9000 handbook, both requirements handbook and measurements handbook. As a result, the statistic results were overwhelming. They overwhelmingly indicated that the validity of TL9000 certificates in the ICT market, that the results were questionable, that those certificates were questionable. As a result, Quest Forum proposed 22 proposals for improvement, 22 suggested improvements. Those improvements impacted our communications to our accreditation bodies and our certification bodies, changes with regard to the accreditation body process, changes with regard to the certification body activities, CB auditor competence requirements, and we also cited a need for ongoing measurement of the third-party process, looking for continual improvement based upon data. Again, we're a data-driven organization. Now, accreditation body organizations, and again, all accreditation body organizations conducted validation audits. They are listed here. And this information is publicly available. You can see that the website is shown on the bottom of the screen. We worked closely with ANAB or ANAB, that's the ASQ National Accreditation Board. We worked with the Austrian Federal Ministry of Economy, Family, and Youth, CNAS, China National Accreditation Service for Conformity Assessment, and then the Japan Accreditation Board along with their Korean Accreditation Board. So that's both JAB and KAB. Our certification body organizations are shown here, and again, this information is publicly available. The website is shown on the bottom of the screen. They are all shown, and we sampled the certification bodies associated with the accreditation bodies seen on the previous slide. We all work together with regard to third-party certification. So Quest Forum, again, that's the organization that owns and develops the TL 9000 handbooks, both the requirements handbooks and the measurements handbook. They're responsible for understanding the industry objectives, the objectives of the ICT industry, and we transform those objectives into requirements. That's both requirements for the organization and also certification requirements impacting certification bodies and requirements impacting accreditation bodies. The accreditation bodies, they apply IAF requirements. Now, IAF, that's the International Accreditation Forum. They're the organization who determines, for example, how many days we would expect to conduct an assessment, a certification assessment. That's dictated through a document called MD5, Mandatory Document Number 5. So the IAF, they write a series of mandatory documents and also informative documents. And those ID and MD documents, they provide requirements with regard to the certification process. So the accreditation bodies, they apply those IAF requirements and practices to the Quest Forum certification requirements. They also evaluate, manage, and improve certification body performance. Now, the certification body organizations, those are the organizations that audit the companies achieving TL 9000 certification. So they are in turn required to address all Quest Forum and also accreditation body requirements. They have to assure that the folks that are doing the audit, the auditors, they have to assure that they're competent, that they're knowledgeable. And they actually are responsible for the performance of the certification assessment. So all of us work together with regard to third-party certification. And what Quest Forum did is we applied requirements both to the certification bodies, the organizations who are going in and auditing the TL certified organizations, and also the accreditation body organizations, the checkers who check the checkers. That's a nice way to think about it. So I told you we're a data-driven organization. For quite some time, frankly, from 2005 to 2015, from 2005 to 2015, Quest Forum required certification body organizations to report performance measures to us. Now, the data was intended for self-analysis by the CBs, and we were hoping the ABs would get on the act too. But we realized that because we didn't have a real requirement to use the data, the use of the data was inconsistent. So even though we were collecting data and we were hoping that folks would be as data-driven as we recognized that there was really no carrot to ask folks or cause folks to utilize this data. So as an outcome of the validation audit results, Quest Forum decided to use the data to identify areas for investigation and improvement. The details for this expected use for improvement of the data, that was identified in a TL 9000 alert. Now, alerts are issued by Quest Forum specifically for TL 9000. They don't change the requirements, but they provide information explaining requirements. And so the alert that was issued, it was issued in 2016, therefore 16-003A. 003A means it was the third alert issued in 2016. And so that's why we see that the data was gathered from 2005 to 2015. It was gathered for self-analysis, for self-use. But we realized in 2016 we needed to put some more requirements with regard to our expectation for use of the data. Our expectations for use of the data, well, quarterly, we expect certification body organizations to report this required information as shown on screen. Quarterly, certification body organizations are required to report the number of TL 9000 surveillance assessments or surveillance audits conducted, the number of TL 9000 certification audits conducted, and the number of TL 9000 certifications issued, initial certifications issued. Additionally, they are required to report quarterly the total number of major nonconformities, the total number of minor nonconformities, and the total number of opportunities for improvement. Now, in our code of practice, we define a major nonconformity. We define a minor nonconformity. We define opportunities for improvement. So we provide explanation with regard to what are those things for our industry. Quarterly required information includes the number of audit days conducted for certification, the number of audit days conducted for surveillance, the minimum days required for certification, and the minimum days required for surveillance. Now, let's talk about the minimum days. When it comes to the minimum days, you heard me say that there is a document that talks about how many days it takes to conduct an audit, and that document is issued by the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. Well, the IAF, they issued this document called MD5, Mandatory Document 5. It talks about duration. We have a TL 9000 audit days table that takes consideration of MD5, but it adds days specifically for TL 9000 assessment. And so when we look at the minimum days, we have an expectation with regard to how many days it would take to do an audit for TL 9000 certification purposes, and we talk about the minimum days required for certification and also for surveillance. We're talking total days with regard to the audit, not just the days allocated for the TL audit days table, but the total days for the audit. Now, as an optional, we also ask certification body organizations to report the identified ISO 9001 clause or the TL 9000 additional requirement known as an adder that nonconformities are cited against. That data is optional, but we've realized that all of our certification body organizations have been reporting that data. So it does remain an optional submission right now, but we see that organizations are indeed reporting that information. We looked at whether or not to make it mandatory, and because most folks opted in, we didn't feel a need to make that information mandatory at this point. I recognize that in some industries that information is mandatory, but it's not mandatory with regard to ICT at this time. Based on the data that we've been collecting, remember we've been collecting data for quite some time, what's shown on screen is an excerpt with regard to the TL 9000 CB audit statistics. We see our quarterly data shown. We see the number of surveillance audits completed, the number of registration audits completed, the number of registrations issued. Now notice that the number of audits has decreased. Within our industry, and that's what we show when we look at the red. So you'll look at Q1 2014 and we see a high number. As we move to Q1 2015, we see a decrease, and then we see some stabilization as we move to Q1 2016. That's because in our industry, we've noticed that organizations tend to be gobbled up. And I'll use one organization as an example. There used to be an organization called Alcatel-Lucent. Alcatel-Lucent has changed names, and they're now a part of Nokia. And so we see that happening quite a bit in our industry where we're seeing consolidation, those types of things. And so as we see this consolidation occurring, we recognize that the number of audits that are actually conducted, that number is going to decrease. So that's what we see with regard to this slide. Because the number of audits are decreasing, we would expect the number of associated findings, and we're talking major, minor opportunities for improvement, that's also going to decrease because we're seeing consolidation. The population isn't as big. What's interesting is when we look at the minimum days, we would expect this to be a one-to-one, but we realized that it wasn't a one-to-one, meaning we were below the minimum. Interesting. When we look at the findings per day, and this is a graphical representation, this is a little bit easier to see. When we look at the findings per day, What was interesting about that is we noticed that there was a downward trend with regard to the minor findings per audit day. When we look at the minor findings per audit day, which is the green, which is the blue, when we look at the minor findings per audit day, we see that it's showing a downward trend. Now, we're seeing a little bit of instability initially with regard to OFI. When we dug deeper with regard to the minor findings per audit days, we recognized that within the Americas, ANAB had 14 CBs reporting information. Within Asia Pac, we had 3 certification body organizations reporting information, and within EMEA, we had one AB with 1 associated CB reporting information. But what was interesting with regard to, and let me go back to this slide here. What's interesting with regard to this slide is that ANAB, they've got 14 certification bodies. Within Asia Pac, we've got 16 CBs across 3 ABs. We see that a large number of the nonconformities, they're coming out of the Americas. Now, keep in mind, EMEA, it's going to fluctuate because we've only got 1 CB reporting with regard to 1 AB. But when you look at the Americas, we've got 14 CBs versus Asia Pac with 16 CBs, and we see that a larger number of the minor nonconformities are with regard to the Americas. When we look at the major nonconformities, we see that a majority of the major nonconformities per audit day are coming from the Americas. You'll see the green line shows the total with regard to the Americas. The minor nonconformities. Now, I know this slide looks ugly, but hang on a minute. You got to take out EMEA because remember, that's 1 certification body reporting with regard to 1 AB. And so that red line, it's going to dance, it's going to jump. So let's take away the red line and let's just look at Asia Pac, which with regard to purple, we'll see Americas with regard to green. And so when we look at the purple versus the green, we see that it's 1.5 or almost 2 times the number of nonconformities with regard to Americas versus Asia Pac. So we see that that's a little bit of a jump there. So what we notice is there's a regional difference. There's a regional difference. We don't know the reason for the regional difference, but we notice there's a regional difference. Again, as I said previously, we also noticed that we were below the minimum days with regard to our audit days table. We were below. But notice on the back end, folks, as we gain more data, if you look at the 2016 data, we're seeing an upward tick. So we're seeing not only are we meeting the minimum days, but we see where the days with regard to the audit days, they are increasing. We're happy to see that we're spending the time necessary, we hope, to conduct an effective certification audit. So based on the CB measurements reporting, as a summary, we saw very few major nonconformities, and we did see what's key about that is we noticed some regional differences. We noticed that there was a difference between CBs on the number of findings per audit day for both major and minor. And we noticed that CBs were performing audits at less than the required number of minimum days. And we said, obviously, there was some confusion on how to calculate the minimum versus the actual, and we took it upon ourselves at Quest Forum to address that confusion. If you're interested in learning more with regard to that data, keep in mind, we've been collecting that data since 2005, and we've got data going from 2005 until current. If you're interested in learning more about that data, there was a webinar that was put together and presented. The webinar was called TL9000 Worldwide Audit Findings Summary, The Facts and Trends. That webinar was conducted January 7, 2016. It was conducted by Quest Forum's Chief Technical Officer, Ken Kaufman, and it is publicly available at the website shown. You can simply go to www.questforum.org. You'll select initiatives, and from initiatives, you'll select Quest Forum Academy, and you'll be able to find all of our webinars that have been conducted to date. You'll be able to find and access the webinar recording along with the slides, and in some cases, question and answers are also available. All of this information is made publicly available at no charge. Well, we had such success with regard to collecting data, and we noticed an upward tick with regard to the fact that we were no longer just at minimum days or even below minimum audit days. We realized that we were seeing movement above the minimum audit days. So Quest Forum's executive board, they said, let's do more. They requested an ongoing oversight proposal to collect data that confirms our third-party assessment program continues to be consistently implemented and effective. And we said, we're going to also see if we can maybe collect some data for improvement, some actionable data for improvement. Implementation for this proposal was requested in 2016. And this is how our third-party effectiveness verification program, to try to say that a lot of times quickly. That's not a Peter Piper picked a pepper. The third-party effectiveness verification program, which we call the 3P EVP program. A little bit easier to say. The 3P EVP program. It was born in 2016. Now, the 3P EVP program, it requires everybody partnering together once again. You've got Quest Forum working with our accreditation body organizations, who in turn work with our certification body organizations, and they are the people auditing the TL 9000 certified organizations. All of these folks work together, Quest Forum, the ABs, the CBs. Now, the certified organization, they're responsible for maintaining a TL 9000 compliant quality management system. They maintain a TL 9000 conforming management system. I'll use the word conforming instead of compliant. Now, what's interesting is organizations are not to be evaluated by the 3P EVP process. The organizations, they're not the ones being evaluated here. Quest Forum, they set the requirements for TL 9000 certification. So they set the requirements with regard to the certification process. The ABs, they evaluate the CBs, and they assure that TL 9000 certification requirements are satisfied. And then the CB, they evaluate the organization to determine if the requirements indeed are satisfied by the organization. The 3P EVP program intends to assure the integrity and effectiveness of the Quest Forum organization, the ABs, and the CBs. Now, the process, the 3P EVP process, was developed to drive improvement in the TL 9000 third-party certification process. Now, how this works, ABs and CBs who are performing within an identified norm, they're not going to be affected. They're not going to be affected. The process is going to focus on ABs or CBs who warrant investigation, and that's going to be those ABs and those CBs who are performing outside of the norm. We'll talk about the norm in just a minute, also known as triggers. Now, the TL 9000 certified organizational data, anything pertaining to the organization, that's kept in confidence, and that's not available to Quest Forum staff, to Quest Forum subject matter experts or SMEs, or Quest Forum volunteers. That information, as far as information pertaining to the TL 9000 certified organization, that's kept in confidence. Information with regard to the AB and the CB performance, that information is kept confidential, and that's limited to a small group of Quest Forum subject matter experts. All of those subject matter experts, known as the AB Approval Board, they have signed non-disclosure agreements. So we do not talk in terms of specific ABs and specific CBs. This chart, I know it's an eye test, so I'm sorry about that. This chart is intended to show the process flow, and the colors represent who's doing what. So where you see, for example, the pink information. The pink information, that's specifically steps or responsibility of the CB. Now notice you'll see in the top right-hand corner, the CB collects data on its performance. And then in the bottom of the slide, you'll see in the middle, trigger 1 or trigger 2. That's where we talk about the norm. We talk in terms of trigger. We have a trigger 1 and a trigger 2. Let's talk about this process. So the University of Texas at Dallas, when I talked earlier about how the TL 9000 standard consists of two handbooks, requirements and measurements, TL 9000 certified organizations are required to submit measurements data on a monthly basis. And that measurements data is submitted to our measurements administrator, also known as the University of Texas at Dallas. Now, because we've got a relationship with the University of Texas at Dallas, we've been utilizing them to gather data for TL 9000 certified organizations since the beginning, but since TL 9000 was first created back in 1988. So we capture data and we generate scorecards. That's what the University of Texas at Dallas does. They capture the AB data and the CB data. And they also provide trigger notifications, the trigger point notification. So that's if an organization is beyond the norm for the trigger 1 or the trigger 2, they'll provide that notification. So that's what the University of Texas at Dallas does. The certification body, they're responsible for collecting and submitting the data to UTD. So they gather the data, and that's how the scorecards are generated. The AB organization, they also collect and submit data to UTD for their scorecard generation. Now, the ABs, they also may perform certification body or CB investigations per the Quest form request for our AB approval body request. And they may be also asked to perform something called a market surveillance. Now, the market surveillance, that is performed in accordance with the IAF, the International Accreditation Form document, and that's the MD document that talks about how to do market surveillance. Now, if you're interested, that document, it's publicly available. If you go to the IAF.nu, you can find all of the documents that I'm talking about with regard to the IAF. The AB Approval Board, they set the scorecard trigger points, and they're going to do that, and it's going to be approved by an organization, a working group, called the Oversight Working Group, or OSWG. So the OSWG, or the Oversight Working Group, they approve the trigger points. They approve those nominal levels, or those normal levels. The ABs are notified when action needs to be taken with regard to the scorecard trigger point. The approval board, they're going to say, hey, ABs, it's time for you to take action. They're going to say, hey, ABs, it's time for you to do a market surveillance. The AB approval board, they're going to evaluate the actions that come out of the request with regard to the trigger point or the request with regard to the market surveillance. They're going to evaluate that. Now, the Oversight Work Group, or the OSWG, they approve the process that's utilized. They approve the trigger point. They appoint the AB approval board members, ensuring that confidentiality and making sure that we avoid conflict of interest. The program is not expected to cost the certified organization. It's not expected to cost Quest Forum members. The ABs who are directed to take action, there may be some costs with regard to the fact that they've got to do a market surveillance, they've got to do analysis. In the case of market surveillance, TL certified organizations, they are not going to incur costs. We're not expecting that cost to be burdened by the certified organization. Now, the TL certified organizations, they may feel some interruption because we're talking about an audit activity. We're talking about surveillance activities. This is difficult to monetize. With that in mind, program costs are expected to be small. Program costs are expected to be small and will likely impact only the affected CBs, those CBs that reach the triggers, and indirectly their certified organizations. Now, when it comes to the triggers, the AB who has accredited the CB to perform those TL assessments, they are at a trigger 1 point asked to perform an investigation of the CB and report back to Quest Forum with root cause analysis, corrective action, and completion targets as far as when those actions should be addressed. Now, if it's a trigger 2 is a little more severe. If it's a trigger 2, we're expecting an investigation. We're expecting report back with regard to root cause analysis, corrective action, and completion targets. But now we're asking for a market surveillance. It's, again, an escalation. We've risen to a trigger 2. So we established trigger 1 and trigger 2. Now, the trigger 1 and the trigger 2, how did we establish that? Well, it was based on the norm. So, again, we've had data. Statistical techniques were used to develop the trigger point. We've got several years' worth of data. The initial trigger point, where we started, we said we've got to start somewhere. Let's start. So we started with number of findings per audit day. Now, we share your concern with regard to this because we recognize we're not asking folks to write findings for the sheer joy and pleasure of writing findings. And I recognize that in some municipalities, sometimes police officers are believed to write tickets just because they need to write to make their ticket quota. That's not what we're trying to drive here. We want to make sure that audits continue to be effective. But we said, let's start somewhere. So this is where we started. Future trigger points will be considered as more data is collected by our CBs and our ABs. So I'm not going to talk in detail with regard to this chart. I know it's an eye chart, but this shows you how we went about identifying the level with regard to the trigger 1 and the trigger 2. So we said the trigger 1, that would be anyone who's 25% less than the rolling average, and the trigger 2 would be anyone who's 40% less than the rolling average. So we said, let's just go ask questions. And really, folks, that's what the first trigger is. And the second trigger, it always starts, trigger 1 and trigger 2, it always starts with perform an investigation. So we started with, let's ask some questions. As you see, we had a lot of opportunity to ask questions. Keeping in mind the yellow, we're looking at trigger 1. The red, we're looking at trigger 2. Lots of opportunity to start the investigation. So we mapped out the steps to implement our process, and our process is called QFP034. We created requirements for the AB quarterly data submission, and we provided that to UTD for development at the University of Texas at Dallas. The data system was announced to the ABs, and it's in use. We identified the first set of certification bodies that we wanted to send to the ABs to request investigation. We created an alert to go to the ABs and the CBs to explain the process, the quest form process number 34. We distributed that alert. You'll see that's the same alert, 2016-003A. And with that said, we sent the first set of CB names, and that's the CBs who had met the trigger 1 and also the trigger 2. We saw that there was 1 CB at a trigger 1, and there were 4 CBs at a trigger 2. Again, non-disclosure agreements were signed for all of our AB approval board members, and we followed up with the ABs, making sure that the investigation was happening. Based on conversations with the ABs and based on their conversations with their CBs, we made some changes to the quest form process, and it's now a QFE. The QFE means that it's publicly available and anyone can be able to access that. It's QFE 034. QFE 034. Total number of nonconformities were asked of the ABs. So we said, hey, CBs, we've been requesting data for some time now. Let's request data from our ABs. We're asking these ABs to indeed take action with regard to the CBs based on trigger 1 and trigger 2. So let's ask for data. Let's ask for a scorecard with regard to the ABs too. So from the ABs, we asked for the total number of nonconformities issued to the CB, both major and minor. And with regard to the total number of nonconformities issued, we specifically asked how many of those nonconformities were issued due to soft grading or due to an audit report technical review ineffectiveness or inappropriate time spent auditing measurements, ineffective measurements auditing, improper personnel competence, improper or insufficient evidence supporting the conclusion of the audit, failure to complete the plan, failure to complete 17021-1, and those are the requirements that our certification body organizations are expected to comply with regard to accredited certification, failure to complete the required process, failure to complete the quest form additions for the type of audit that's being performed. We looked at the number of CB suspensions, the number of withdrawals as a percent of the total accreditations, the number of witnessed audits that were conducted, and the number of office assessments conducted. So we asked the ABs to submit this data like we were asking the CBs to submit data. So in 2017, the status of the first round, remember we had 1 trigger 1 and 4 trigger 2s. We received detailed responses from the CBs. Market surveillances were conducted for 2 of the CBs. Reports and action plans were received, and we monitored the plans. Now, you notice that market surveillances were conducted for 2 of the CPs, the certification body organizations. Remember, we had to tweak the program a little bit because what we really wanted to have happen is this investigation, this conversation. We wanted to know what's going on. We weren't trying to drive, and we aren't trying to drive, hey, more nonconformities, more nonconformities, more nonconformities. We really wanted to understand if nonconformities were not being written, why? What's going on? So again, market surveillances were conducted for 2 CBs. Reports and action plans were received, and we were monitoring progress. With regard to the AB data, 4 of the ABs have submitted first and second quarter data, 3 have submitted third quarter data, and 1 has submitted fourth quarter data. We find that if accreditation body organizations aren't cooperating with us, we are indeed investigating action to have them ejected from the program possibility. That's a possibility, guys. We are working with everyone because this is a new program and these are some new requirements. So we recognize that everybody's going to have to do things differently and change takes time. So again, conversations are going on, requirements are being established, and we are reporting and tracking. The second round, notices were sent. We had 1 AB who had no CBs below the trigger. We had 2 ABs that had the same CBs as before. 1 was showing progress and 1 no progress as of yet. We had 1 AB who had 1 trigger 1 and 5 trigger 2s. That included 1 previous trigger 2 that had shown some progress. We were currently at the office assessment stage, and there were market surveillances pending. We've got 1 AB who has 1 trigger 1 and 7 trigger 2s, and that included 1 previous trigger 2, which was showing some progress. So we see some data jumps here. What we've seen is where there may be potential evidence of soft grading, but we need to continue to monitor data, remembering that our goal is to assure that TL 9000 certified organizations produce quality products and services consistently, and we also demonstrate continual improvement. So we'll continue to monitor the data. We'll continue to have the conversations. And again, that's what I'm very excited about. The fact that we're having conversations, the fact that we're doing investigations, the fact that we're asking questions. The fact that this program is so new and novel, it's been highlighted in a UNIDO release. It's been highlighted in the good practices experience in the market surveillance of ISO 9001 Quality Management Systems publication. This publication is publicly available. You'll find it at unido.org, and you'll find it under their news publication information, where it talks about how we've launched our third-party evaluation program, or 3P EVP program, that looks into specific CB and AB performance using a predefined set of criteria. As we move forward, we may establish future trigger points. Data is going to continue to be selected and collected. Trends will be evaluated, and trigger points may be proposed if the data warrants. The Quest Form Oversight Work Group, they'll be responsible for approving any new triggers, and that will happen by vote. I thank you for listening. I hope that I've triggered some questions for you. We welcome your questions.
Thanks, Sharonda. This ends our presentation. Thanks for attending.